When we first decided on the title of Deborah Leipziger's session, 100 Words That Define the Future, we immediately felt that it would be an apt conclusion to day 5 of our conference, which covers the theme, the future of sustainability. Deborah has advised various companies and organizations around the world on social and environmental issues, covering fields as diverse as mining, technology, fashion, and food. She has also been a pioneer in co-authoring standards such as the Social Accountability 8000, as well as the Ethical Trading Initiative, and she has also done consulting for the United Nations. Join us for this session as we uncover some of the new vocabulary that will allow us to have a synchronized view on the topic of sustainability and its many aspects. We will uncover phrases such as extractive and generative mindsets, what a positive maverick should be, the benefits of social design, as well as items such as neurodiversity and inclusive hiring. To audience members, thank you for staying with us for this final session of the Inspired Conference. Here on day 5, we are looking into the future of sustainability. And we have with us Ms. Deborah Leipziger. Deborah has done tremendous amount of good work in the fields of social innovation, corporate responsibility, and has authored and co-authored several books and standards in those areas as well. And Deborah will be looking into a very unique way of exploring sustainability. As the title of this session suggests, we are going to try and come up with, or at least help the audience get onto this journey of looking at the 100 words that define the future. So if I may begin, Deborah, you have a blog titled The Language of Sustainability. Could you perhaps share with the audience members, how would you define the word sustainability? I mean, everyone seems to have different definitions of their own. And perhaps it's more than just definition. Perhaps sustainability is a journey that individuals or organizations go through.
Wonderful question. Absolutely. I tell companies that I work with that sustainability is a journey, and I think that's a great metaphor. For me, sustainability is about transformation, and it's both social and environmental. It's about new ways of thinking and new ways of being, and that's part of why we need new language, new paradigms to help us in this transformation. And I think of it as transformation for communities, for business, for countries, and for ourselves too, because to achieve sustainability, we need new paradigms and new ways of being in the world. I love the definition from Gro Harlem Brundtland from 1987 of sustainable development, that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I think that is a really helpful framework for us. And the big journey that I see companies transitioning, where they will need to transition, is from an extractive mindset to a generative mindset. And I think this is the shift that companies will need to make. And many of them are beginning to understand this new journey.
Could you perhaps elaborate on what you mean by extractive and generative mindsets?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think that the future of sustainability is looking at ways in which companies can be resource positive, in which we can generate new types of innovation, new types of resources, new types of designs. I think a lot of the challenge is rethinking basically everything. What do we produce? How do we produce it? How do we transport it? How do we hire people? And so I think it's looking at generative models that take the Earth's limits into account. So rather than just consuming and extracting, companies and organizations are actually generating wealth in ways that build resilience and are regenerative. So I think that's part of what we're seeing in kind of a broader definition of sustainability.
If I may summarize, that would be putting back in what one has taken out.
Exactly, but also potentially generating more. So can we even come out resource positive? And I think that that's a challenge for companies. So it's not enough to just incrementally do less damage, but how can we actually produce items that have a regenerative capacity, and how can we redesign processes to generate new types of resources, new types of energy.
That's wonderful. And if we then go from the definition of just the word sustainability to looking into the language of sustainability, which is one of the workshops that you run.
Yes.
You mentioned that enterprises are coming to new terms in terms of creating social value, coming up with these new terms to advance the SDGs as well. Could you perhaps give examples of some of this new vocabulary, and perhaps also how do we prevent them from being abused, so to speak? I mean, we see phrases like digital transformation, the circular economy, even the SDGs. I mean, organizations are jumping onto the bandwagon and claiming that they're adhering or applying all these standards, but in reality, it's a PR smokescreen.
Great questions. So I wanted to share a couple of stories because I think stories are really powerful for telling the story of sustainability and the journeys that companies have made and organizations have made. So one of my favorite examples of new language is the story of Grayston. Is a bakery that produces brownies. And I tell people that if you've had Ben & Jerry's, you've probably come in contact with a Grayston brownie. And it's a very compelling story because what they do is they have a program called open hiring. And so they hire people who would probably never get a job otherwise. So they might be formerly homeless, refugees, in the past, people with HIV/AIDS. They're looking at ways in which they can heal social inequality and literally bringing people into the economy, maybe for the first time. And the idea is to provide a wide range of services. So as they started, they had access to housing, access to childcare, healthcare for people who were facing illness, and to really look holistically at hiring, because one of the interesting things about homelessness is that it's a product of many factors, and so it's looking at a system and why is it hard for homeless people to find work? Oftentimes because they have children, or because they're ill, or simply because they haven't been given opportunities. So open hiring, also called sometimes inclusive hiring, is a way of hiring that takes away the barriers to jobs. And I think a lot of the way in which hiring and recruitment works is putting up barriers between people and jobs. And oftentimes those barriers keep out people who have already suffered a lot of injustice. And so the open hiring model is very powerful as a tool to bring people into the economy. And the company was founded by Bernie Glassman, who is a remarkable person. He was a rocket scientist at NASA and decided to study Buddhism became a Buddhist monk and realized that there was a lot of work to do in the world to address problems like homelessness, and founded Greyston to find opportunities for employment for marginalized people. And as a result, thousands of people have come into the economy, and many of them have gone on to do all kinds of other interesting work. But the idea is the concept that Bernie came up with of open hiring, and also a Buddhist concept of path making, that we're all on a path, and helping people to get on a path, a journey of transformation. And so I think it's a really wonderful story. I've written a lot about Greyston and teach it in my MBA classes that I've done. So it's a very compelling story, I think, of social transformation and actually getting at systemic issues that are barriers to inclusion and diversity and justice. And you asked also about how do we prevent the SDGs from becoming kind of a greenwashing or a blue washing. I've also heard the term. I think it's really important for companies and organizations in general to think about the SDGs as a whole and their interconnection, because I see a lot of companies say, okay, well, we picked this SDG and we're going to focus on oceans. And I think, that's a good start, but they are all interconnected. And I think that's part of what makes sustainability so compelling, are these interconnections. And so if you look, for example, at the story of Greyston and open hiring, they are working on one of the toughest goals of the SDGs, which is ending poverty, fighting hunger. They are interrelated, and promoting social inclusion. These are interrelated goals. And so I think for many companies, they view it as an exercise, and we pick this one. This one relates to our work, but I think the challenge is to understand the full interconnectedness of what your business does, what its impact is, but also what it could be, how it could be transformed to look deeply at becoming a more generative business.
Thank you, Deborah. I mean, it's one of those things where I think we see a lot of organizations come up with something or run their business and then try and map it against the SDGs. Whereas, these principles, these SDGs, should actually be at the heart of the decision making in the first place.
Absolutely. Well said.
If I may go back to your story about Greyston,
Yes.
How would you perhaps relate that to what are some of the vocabulary that has emerged from this?
That's a great question. I think that a lot of possibilities there for interesting opportunities to think about language. One of my favorite terms that I like to use is the term positive maverick. And I think Bernie Glassman, Mike Brady, others at Greyston are exactly that. They're positive mavericks who are changing the way a process like hiring is done. And I think that has an incredible impact. I also like the term social design. And I think that is very compelling. That's a term developed by Cheryl Heller, and who's one of the very well-known people in the field of design. And so she's developed this concept that social design is about redesigning everything, redesigning products, redesigning relationships, redesigning hiring, that we can shift the way that we do things. And the design concept, I think, is helpful because it's intentional. So I think to your point about the SDGs, it's not just something that companies write a check or do a study or have a conference, but it's really about designing and redesigning to address social issues and environmental issues. And I think Grayston is a great example of that. Social design is a very helpful way of promoting sustainability and really getting deep into the SDGs, because we can't achieve the SDGs in the way that we have been operating. We need new language, new paradigms, new design.
Definitely, and I think I must have stumbled across one of your articles maybe about Grayston, but I recall as well that they at one point, or maybe still are hiring former prison inmates and giving them a second chance in life.
Exactly, and I think that's really an incredible story. And I've been fortunate enough to visit Grayston 3 times, and every time that I meet the people who work there, I'm just so inspired by their journeys. And often, like, I have tears in my eyes because I see the journeys that they've made, and many of them have never had a job in the legal economy, it's such a shift, and they never thought about themselves as being able to have children or have a bank account, and these are all new things. Having health insurance and path making helps them develop those opportunities, because it's not something that we are born knowing. We're not born knowing how to find a job or how to talk to a boss. And so I think that approach to hiring is really helpful, and I've worked with some of my clients to develop that, and I think it can be tailored to any kind of organization that can perhaps is looking at promoting refugees or women or veterans. It's very flexible as a model, and I think it makes good business sense too, because in many sectors companies have a hard time finding a good workforce.
I think a lot of this comes back to humanity, really, and how social design, you mentioned, is such a great phrase in terms of describing really these actions or these endeavors which support humanity. So if I now zoom out from maybe this example of Grayston and the themes that surround this story, and to look at the SDGs as a whole. And in one of your blog posts, you describe the language of the SDGs as cross-cutting.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at goal 17, partnerships, would you therefore agree, or would you say that goal 17 is the most difficult to achieve, given that there is a definite tendency to work across silos, whether it be individuals or organizations?
It's a fascinating question. I've been thinking about it. I think that I'm glad you mentioned collective action, because I think that is absolutely the way forward in sustainability. And I just launched a white paper with High Meadows Institute about collective action. And we have hundreds and hundreds of partnerships, industry initiatives that are working nationally, regionally, globally, at a sector level. So I think that there is a lot of collective action, and I think that is absolutely necessary. In my mind, I think that the SDG that focuses on peace and institutions, peace, justice, and institutions, I think is perhaps the harder one, because I think changing institutions, I think has proven really difficult. So I think the power structures, the corruption, the bureaucracy, the sense of entitlement, I think that to me is, if there is a very challenging one, where I see less progress, I think it's that one. I think we need to do much better in our institutions, and I think we're seeing that here in the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement. We're seeing, you know, police forces that are racist and using brutality. That kind of transformation of organizations and institutions is very challenging, and you're literally dismantling hundreds and hundred years of history in that process. And so I think that, to me, is perhaps the more difficult one. I think we're seeing with the pandemic a lot of collective action, because we see that we are all linked, and no country, no institution is going to be able to do this alone. So I think in many ways the pandemic has shown us our vulnerability, our interconnection, and has spawned some really powerful examples of collective action. And I was just last Friday listening to Business Fights Poverty, a wonderful institution, and they were promoting a webinar around what's happening in Kenya. So Kenya has a compact that combines business and organizations devoted to youth, the Kenyan government, and then also technology companies. And so working to raise awareness of hand washing and providing opportunities for hand washing and mobilizing youth. And so I think we're seeing a lot of really powerful collective action around the pandemic, but also in other ways. And what I like to call industrial symbiosis, companies working together so that the waste of one company can be used as a raw material for another company. So I think collective action is the answer, and is definitely we are well on the journey. It's not perfect. Where I think we have challenges is governance of these institutions developed through collective action, and governance of institutions to become more just and more sustainable.
Thank you, Deborah. You mentioned, this concept of collective action, and I think earlier on you alluded to as well the fact that organizations should not focus on choose one SDG and let's just work on that one, and the fact that all the SDGs are tied together. At this point, I would like to take the opportunity to point out to our audience members that on our Inspired Community app, we have 5 different channels for the themes for each theme of the 5 days. But we also have these cross-cutting themes, looking into the likes of leadership for sustainability, inclusion and diversity, and there are 4 of these in total, which span the 5 days. So as I take this as an example of how we have these cross-cutting themes from our conference, Deborah, could you perhaps select one of these and demonstrate how you would create a language of change around it?
Absolutely, and I'm pleased to see that you're looking at cross-cutting themes, weaving it through the conference. I think that's excellent. I would focus on inclusion and diversity and the language of inclusion and diversity, because I think, as with sustainability, I think we're really in the infancy of developing useful terminology for the field of inclusion and diversity. And even the term inclusion is not a term that I particularly like, because it kind of suggests, well, we will agree to include you. Like it has a kind of us and them built into it. But I do consider the term open hiring to be a good aspect of thinking about inclusion and diversity, because I think so much of corporate work in this area is trying to bring people who are different into an organization, without changing the organization. And that's not going to work because people will not feel welcome. So as we talked about, institution building aspect of it. So I think inclusion and diversity is very tied to the values of the company. And some of the terms that I like to share with organizations, and I did a project for MIT talking with their recruitment and hiring about different types of diversity. And one of the terms I think is really useful is the term neurodiversity. So that's something that we're talking a lot about in the United States, and especially in technology companies. So how do you design meetings and hiring and work to address the needs of people who are neurodiverse? And so that is people who are on the spectrum, people with different kinds of mental issues, mental illness. How do you craft a workplace that is welcoming and can address those needs? And even issues, I think that's kind of interesting, issues around people who are introverted or extroverted. How do you make people feel welcome in meetings? And especially now that we're looking at remote working, how do you structure a workplace that is welcoming to everyone, including people who are neurodiverse? So I think that's quite a useful term. I also like the term upstander, and I think it's really important to encourage people to be upstanders, to signal and when there is some kind of injustice or microaggression, or that we should be upstanders, and we should teach people that is a valuable thing, and we should model. How do we do that when someone makes a racist comment or a sexist comment in the workplace, in a social organization? How do we stand up and say that's offensive, or I don't think you realize, but that's offensive to me? So I think that's something that we should be teaching in schools, how to stand up for ourselves and other people when we or someone is somehow attacked or embarrassed or put down. So really learning that language of speaking up and confronting injustice. So I do really like the term upstander. And the other term that I wanted to share is the concept of cultural add. So looking at diverse hiring as a way of adding to the culture and knowledge of the company, I think is really powerful. And another concept to share in terms of words that can kind of take us forward. I love the concept that Dell has, the company Dell has set up moonshot goals. So they are setting up goals, they've articulated goals, and by 2030, by 2040, they hope to have, I think it's 40% of leaders will be women, 50% of the workforce will be women. And so I think that's really important. Again, setting an intention and realizing we have a lot of work to do, but making a commitment and doing that intentionally. So I think that concept of saying we commit to hiring women, we commit to bringing women into the tech space, because it's not, in many cultures, not a natural thing for women to go into technology. So how do we build a society that's friendly to women in tech?
Certainly, and if I were to, tap from what you mentioned about upstanders, I just by sheer coincidence read it in the newspapers today. There's this young lady, I think she's 19 or 20 now, and she decided finally after many years to relay on Twitter her experience of sexual assault when she was 14. And she did it with the mindset that, okay, you know, there will be criticism, there will be inflammatory messaging coming from the Twitterverse. But in reality, what happened was, in addition to empowering herself, she then empowered many others as well. And you know, she picked up, I think, almost 20 other stories where these other young ladies had also then come out because of her to share their stories of sexual assault. And I think it's so important. We look at the Me Too movement as well. It's so important for the role of upstanders to empower those around them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's contagious, right? Like when one person is courageous and makes a statement, is vulnerable, it helps other people to do that. And I think if we don't confront it, it just continues. So that's a really powerful story.
So Deborah, I mentioned at the start you have authored or co-authored as well some standards, for example, the Corporate Responsibility Codebook, Social Accountability 8000. There also exists some bodies of accreditation or certification, such as the likes of B Corp, that help organizations to kind of go through a set of matrices and then try to adhere to the standards that I guess these organizations are setting for themselves, really. What would you see, Deborah, as the benefits of the standards, for example, those you have authored and co-authored, as well as the certification offered by organizations like B Corp?
Wonderful question. And again, I think there's so much to say here. I think it is important to have common frameworks. And I think codes and standards give common frameworks and shared systems. And I think that that's really helpful. And I think from that, we still have a long way to go to develop shared language around what these terms mean. And so I just wanted to point out a couple of, I think, very successful certification systems. And one of those, you mentioned B Corp, I think has been a really powerful model that has been transformative. And so certifying companies as B corporations that have a social, environmental mission and purpose. And just if you'll allow me one more story that I think is really compelling about B Corp, just to illustrate the kind of impact that it's had. I'm a judge for the Meaningful Business 100, and there's so many wonderful leaders and positive mavericks in the Meaningful Business 100. But one of the ones that's very close by, both geographically here in Boston, but also close to my heart, is Liz Powers, who started art lifting. And art lifting is a community of artists who were either formerly homeless or have disability or both. And so she realized that as a student, when she was a student at Harvard, that there were so many talented artists in the homeless community. And it tells you a little bit about how we value artists, right? And so she founded Art Lifting to help develop ways to sell the work of these amazing artists. And now they represent some 140 different artists throughout the United States, and companies and individuals can buy artwork from these amazing artists. And the reason I mention it is that she tells the story of, she wasn't sure if she wanted to create a nonprofit or a business. And she was very young. She was in her early 20s when she founded Art Lifting. And she decided to set up Art Lifting as a B Corp because she realized the power of business to transform the lives of artists, and that a nonprofit wouldn't have that same capacity necessarily as a business. And so I think it's a great illustration of the power of B Corp as a model redesigning, rethinking business. So I think B Corp is an amazing model. I also think this study that I did of partnerships and industry initiatives, we looked at over 200 different partnerships and industry initiatives, and I think there are a lot of very compelling ones. The Forest Stewardship Council is a very powerful model, over 30 years of certification of wood products, paper products, construction products with a logo. And I think certification is a really powerful process to promote sustainability and really fight deforestation. So I think that's been a wonderful model. And I'm proud of the work that I've been involved with in different social standards, including the Ethical Trading Initiative and SA 8000, Social Accountability 8000, as I think have been very pioneering in that they provide training. I think has been a really important piece of this. So training to workers about their rights, training to managers about what it means to respect human rights, training companies. So I think that awareness raising has really changed the landscape. And then finally, I want to say that I think that these initiatives and codes have created a soft law that is becoming hard law. So a lot of these initiatives, we're seeing in Europe, for example, that initiatives like the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are becoming part of hard law in France, for example, that companies in France are required to conduct a due diligence process about their impact on human rights, both adverse impact and real impact, potential impact. And so that soft law that we've developed is transitioning into hard law. And I think that that's a very powerful thing, but it starts in this case as soft law.
It is certainly very important to have that soft law. I guess, you mentioned the word awareness. Sometimes people claim to not be aware because they truly are not aware. And it can be very surprising the kinds of things that people are still ignorant of.
It's so true. It's so true. And we found, for example, in SA 8000 Ethical Trading Initiative, we found examples of companies, of factories that they would literally beat their workers if they were late, or they would take pay away if they were late. They would force them to run in like 100-degree heat, all of which are illegal practices, under International Labor Organization, really pretty well established. So, and is bad management, in fact. It's not just bad human rights practice, but it's also bad management. So I think it's true that, training, it's really important to raise awareness of what's possible. And I also think that initiatives like the Ethical Trading Initiative have been really powerful in fighting for wages. So a lot of cases of factories that are not paying wages, overtime. And so I think these initiatives have created mechanisms of arbitration that fight for workers who are not paid on time, who are not paid at all, etc. Thank
you. Deborah, you mentioned that you are a judge for the Meaningful Business 100, and the likes of B Corp certify thousands of organizations every year. There must be a lot of data that's flowing around in this space. Would you say that the types of data that are being collected, the indicators that are being measured, would you say that these require improvement? Or would you say that there is sufficient good data that's flowing around, and perhaps we just lack the means to capitalize on this data and accelerate the pace of change, or maybe a combination of both?
I think it's a great question. I think that we have a lot of data. So this is something that the industry initiatives are very good at capturing data. I think where we have problems is that the data isn't necessarily used in decision making. So there's data collection, but then it dies. So I think that that's a real problem. So it's not enough to collect data. You need to use that data to make decisions and to potentially look at environmental and social issues differently based on the data that you're finding. So I think there's a trend to just kind of ignore data, collect it, bury it. And I think there's a huge need for transparency as well. So it's important to make that data available. And that's, I think, an interesting new trend to make kind of openness and transparency of data. And I think that is going to be really important going forward. So I think there's a real wealth of data that does not see the light of day. And that radical transparency, I think, is part of sustainability.
Definitely, and I'm reminded of many organizations that they adhere to these ISO standards, and they have long forms, paperwork, everything gets filed. None of it actually ever becomes meaningful data. So that's a change that has to happen.
Absolutely, and I think sometimes we're so focused on the system and the process that we're not looking at the impact. And I think that's a place where we need more analysis and data is impact. So what is the impact of all this work? And that's the kind of data that I would love to see more of.
Right, so if we now look at moving forward with the fast pace of advancement, especially in technology, and specifically I'm referring to the fields of AI or machine learning, the artificial essentially, and how it's increasingly merging with the organic. Would you say that these fields would help accelerate the SDGs? And maybe as a supplementary question to that, I mean, we have 17 SDGs at the moment. Do you think perhaps in a decade's time, we would need an additional SDG to cope with this particular field?
Very interesting question. I think that artificial intelligence has a lot of the bias of the people who developed it, right? So I think that's one of the big concerns is that a lot of that technology is very biased, and that is something we need to look at. I do think that there are a lot of ways in which we can use technology for good, and that's an area that I think is enormously important. And I would say that I'm not sure that it would be a new SDGs. I think it's how do we take the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and use technology to promote them and show that, because I think a lot of technology exists that will be very helpful for promoting sustainability, but we can't access it, we can't unlock it. And I also think that in this work that I'm doing around shared language, shared vocabulary, that will be a necessary part of machine learning, so that eventually we are using shared vocabulary in the field of sustainability, so that companies reporting are using shared vocabulary, and that those terms can then reports can be machine readable and digitized accordingly. So I think that will help collect data. So just as we have a language in accounting that's shared, we need that for sustainability, and that's part of what I'm on a task force for XBRL, helping to develop that shared language of environmental, social, and governance language, just as we have it in accounting, we need it for ESG and sustainability.
And Deborah, if I may use this opportunity to ask for maybe one final story or one final round of coming up with new language. Specifically, the question is, what do you see as the biggest opportunities as well as the biggest threats in terms of this mission of trying to achieve the SDGs by a certain year, which in this case is 2030?
I think that there's so many opportunities, and that's part of what I find really inspiring in the Meaningful Business 100 is to see leaders, often quite young, who are looking at a social problem and using the power of business to address a social problem or an environmental problem. And I think that that is a real opportunity to think of social problems as an opportunity for business to do things differently, and to have a kind of generative approach to business. I think is really powerful. In terms of threats, I think one of the biggest obstacles is, I think, boards of directors. I feel like boards of directors don't typically consider sustainability to be a real business issue or opportunity. And so I think so much of important work of sustainability is happening at a level that's either philanthropic or very low grade in the company, where it really is, these are strategic issues for the future of our planet, the future of companies. And I think boards of directors are slow to really recognize the significance of social and environmental, both opportunities and threats. And hopefully the pandemic is shifting that.
The pandemic has certainly been a big reset button for many individuals and organizations. We have had a very enriching conversation. Thank you, Deborah. And if I may use this opportunity to remind our audience members, there is the Inspired Community app at Space. Feel free to leave your questions, leave your comments for Deborah, leave some words. I mean, we've spoken about the 100 words that define the future. What are some of the words that would define your future? Do share those with us. And if I may now close, Deborah, by asking two questions. The first one would be, if our audience members are now inspired and they would like to immediately try and create some change, what would be your key takeaway messages for them? And last but not least, how do you see yourself innovating and provoking a change in mindset in your field of expertise within the next year?
Thank you. Those are great questions. I've been reading an amazing book called The Future We Choose by Christiana Figueres, who led the Paris Agreement talks. And it's an incredible book. And she talks about how to work in sustainability and climate change, we need to change our attitudes. And she talks about the need for optimism. The need to embrace a sense of abundance instead of this kind of zero-sum extractive mentality. And also the need for what she calls radical regeneration. And I think it's so helpful because she talks about it at a personal level. So how do we regenerate and build our own resilience? And then how do we bring that to a very broken world? And I think that's really powerful because I think the journey of transformation is both personal and global. And so taking a passion and bringing it to address a social need, a social problem and an environmental issue is a really powerful thing, as many people in the Meaningful Business are doing. Meaningful Business 100 are promoting. So I think that focus on regeneration as a personal process, and also as something to bring into the world, but we can't bring it into the world if we haven't cultivated it ourselves. So I think that's a really powerful message that I want to share. And I think that looking at the language of sustainability and becoming future ready is really powerful. And I do this work with companies all over the world to help them think about how they can become future ready. So that's the work that I'm doing. And I encourage people to share terminology, ideas, paradigms, and especially in other languages. I feel like there are a lot of really interesting concepts from other cultures. Another really like great example of that is the term in Swedish, and forgive my pronunciation, the term lagom, which means enoughness. So we don't have this in English. You know, we in the US, we think, you know, more, we want more of everything. But there's a Swedish concept of lagom, which means you should aim to have just enough. And I love that. I think it's a wonderful philosophy. And I think not having that language in English impairs us it keeps us from thinking about what is enough in our society, what is enough right now. So I think there's such a rich vocabulary from other languages. So I hope you'll share different words that inspire you.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you as well for, you know, mentioning lagom and giving your elaboration into it. I was just about to ask the supplementary question of your favorite word to define the
my
future.
favorite word. Oh, yeah, that's hard. It changes every day. But I really like that one because it really challenges. It really challenges you, and so much of our culture of consumption, right? That we're built around. But yeah, I think every day I'm thinking about new words. So the thing about being an author and a poet is I fell in love with words every day.
Certainly, and to our audience members, you know, we are doing word clouds for every session. You can contribute your word to define the future throughout all the conference sessions for the Inspired Conference. So that brings us to the conclusion of this conversation with Deborah Leipziger. It's been an absolute joy, an absolute pleasure, certainly a very enriching conversation. Once again, thank you for your time, Deborah.
My pleasure. Thank you.